So the classical model in minority influence, active minorities, was proposed by Moscovici, Muñiz, Papastamou, is a classical one. So there is the minority in an antagonism relationship with the power, conflictual relationship, and this minority has the influence relationship with the population, and the power and the majority of population, this power relationship, okay, is a classical one. It was a model of 60s, 80s, but the model is still very actual. For example, the last January here in Paris, the activist of international women's rights group FMN has staged this mock hanging in the Paris Bridge, near from here, I think, to protest the visit of Iranian President Rouhani in Paris. These activists, they protest against the hanging of homosexuals, the stoning of adultery women, and hundreds of death sentences imposed every year in Iranian to feminist freethinkers accused to criticize the theocratic regime. In any case, civil rights movements of the 60s represents the golden age of active minorities. The battle against racism, sexism, imperialism, militarism, patriotism, paternalism, environmental degradation, changes laws and establishes new majority norms. But there is an unfinished conversion. So even if pro-civil rights minorities have caused a shift in public attitudes toward minorities, blacks, foreign, gays, women, etc., they have failed to change daily social practices that perpetuate social discrimination against them. From my theoretical point of view, change of these issues requires a change of folk knowledge, social representations, developed over centuries regarding the heterodox minorities described by Moscovici in 1975. So even if some everyday minority-majority practices like blacks with whites, gypsies with gadget, non-gypsies, women with men, homosexuals, heterosexuals, immigrants, nationals, seems nowadays be guided by public sphere, by egalitarian and non-discriminatory norms. However, prejudice anchored in long-held in-group majority cultural traditions will appear to underline the private sphere, that is, contact of intimate interactions, and it keeps what Moscovici will name the taboo of contact. So the themata underlying social representations of minority groups appears to remain relatively unchanging. As you know, Moscovici defines the themata as evident in the culture of a group, so that its members may not even spell them out in communication. They underline the content, notions, image, and meanings that are just about becoming social share. They also seem to have a generative as well as normative power in the formation of representations, fitting new information that already exists in one. I think this notion of themata is very important to understand this new phenomenon. So let me just show a couple of examples how those themata illustrate this unfinished conversion. I took one, the machismo. So after the feminist movement in the 60s, can be noticed that gender equality in civil rights ensured more emancipation of the woman. In spite of such shift, gender-based prejudice has not disappeared, not even in Western countries. So, just a week after the Iranian president visited Paris last January, the front page of the journal Le Monde reported some figures about the gender violence in France, although results will be better in other Western countries. So the data are 134 women were murdered by their partners, 223,000 women were victims of physical violence, 84,000 women experienced rape, etc. So even I take the data for the French to compare with the feminine activist movement protesting against the president for the Iranian. In France, the minority has also some work to do. That is the point. Even if minorities have achieved this social change regarding their relationships with the ruling powers, laws, they have still failed to change every practices, folk knowledge affecting private interactions between majority and minority members. Social representations of women are still focused on the themata of the culture of honor, that is, representations about the male honor and female chastity, anchored in the patriarchal worldview, and Western individuals will rather believe that such a mentality is just a marginal reminder, but data show otherwise. While women's liberation has increased, the culture of honor has not been changed yet. They represent two different mentalities in conflict. Let me show one more example with racism issue. Excusez un peu d'eau. In racism, we found another case of this gap between the normative and attitudinal shift and representations affecting everyday relationships between majority and minority members. In an impressive work, Schumann and collaborators, they showed a massive shift of white people attitudes toward black people. Racism is no longer a societal issue that it used to be until the 60s. They point out the crucial influence of minority civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. But a pervasive gap between norms or attitudes against discrimination in everyday implementation of egalitarian principles can be observed. Normative and attitudinal change of whites toward blacks are taking place in public rather than in private sphere. Black minority is still discriminated in almost every sphere of daily life, workplaces, college, neighborhoods, business, employment, etc. Theoretical accounts should focus on long-held social representations about blacks that still remain unchanged despite the effort of active minorities. So what representations are operating as an anchor of discriminatory practices? Contemporary ethnic prejudice, despite moral pressure against its manifestation, there is no escape to influence of hegemonic representations of the concerned ethnic minorities. As shown by Jaoda, image of the other as animal, primitive, or savage will not be historical holdovers already overcome. Just yesterday, I read in the press, Spanish press and French press, and I suppose in the United States also, that Pamela Ramsey Taylor, who runs a local nonprofit foundation, Clay Country in West Virginia, referred to Michelle Obama as an ape in heels. Heels, comprends? Talons. Donc, un singe en talons. There is a long discussion today about that. In brief, there is a robust data that animalization, social representation of black people is anchored in the themata of scala natural and still dominant. We work with Moscovici about this hypothesis. So a similar pervasive gap may be argued regarding social relationships with the majority and other minorities groups, such gypsies, Native Americans, Aboriginals, homosexuals, etc. So the emergence of a moral representation of minority discrimination. The fight of civil rights movements transformed the moral perspective from which the majority looks at their own attitudes regarding social minorities. It led the majority to accept principles established in the Declaration of Human Rights and to acknowledge themselves as source of sexism, xenophobic, and racial prejudice that were no longer regarded as right or natural, and a new ethical sensibility result in prejudice being qualified as old-fashioned, a moral flaw on a part of the holder. And nowadays, the expression of stereotypes and prejudice is qualified as moral inferior human being, as Jones writes. So this qualification as immoral of discrimination attitudes that had long been regarded as amoral, if not natural, is one of the most significant changes induced by the civil rights movement. This new ethical culture of forgiveness has established new ways of relationships between the majority and minorities. On the part of the majority, their main concern will be to avoid the moral blemish entailed by minority discrimination, so avoid discrimination. But on the part of the minority, their concern will focus on the acknowledgement in their past and or present condition of victims. This emerging ethical framework provides minorities with the option of relying on a different behavioral style in their interactions with the majority so as to influence them. The new strategy aims at being perceived as victimized minority, trying to obtain recognition as a victim of past or present discrimination. In our modern culture sphere, belonging to a group that perpetrates negative acts against a victim group can induce a distressing moral identity threat, as Branscombe and collaborators show. Whereas belonging to a victimized group may induce a sense of high moral status. Some minority groups previously regarded as marginal, deviated, or anomic by the majority and the ruling powers are nowadays recognized as victims. The transformation in moral representations of social discrimination has resulted in two significant changes regarding majority-minority relations. On the part of the majority, the new ethical paradigm of collective guilt, and on the part of, and dialectically related to, the emergence of new victimized minorities. So let me show, this is an image from the, well, just a couple of studies to illustrate this hypothesis. The participants have to read a report of the history of persecution of the gypsies in Europe. And in the victimized minority condition, after reading the persecution of the gypsies, the victimized minority conclude, we, the gypsies, seek compensation from the state, given that his society has inflicted grave sufferings on us in the past and continues to make us in the present. So it's centered on the gypsies as victimized minority. We compare to active, to the classical minority, active minority condition, the report about excuse, was the same, only the conclusion was different. The conclusion for the active minority was, we gypsies should mobilize and fight actively until we achieve a radical change in this society that which has persecuted us so gravely and continues to persecute us. The results show that an ethical relationship is established with the victimized minority, whereas the active minority erodes an antagonist relationship and thus an external conflict with the majority. Compared to active minorities, victimized minorities elicit more guilt within the majority, a greater moral conflict, and the gypsies, they obtain more favorable attitudes toward compensation of gypsies for past wrongdoings. For example, special rights must be granted to gypsies to erase memory of this horrible past. The result is the same in both studies. Meanwhile, the active minorities elicit a socio-political conflict that entails more manifest reluctance to compensate minorities for past wrongdoings, but they induce a larger positive shift in latent attitudes. For example, they don't agree with the idea that gypsies are less concerned about technological progress in our society than non-gypsy. So victimized minorities fail to convert the majority. The gadget, non-gypsies, feel guilty regarding historical persecution of the gypsies, and they are more likely to admit to the need of compensation measures, but they still stick to the representation that gypsies live in social marginality because they lack self-improvement motivation. Such a social explanation results in a reduction of moral conflict that would arise in gadget, non-gypsies, in the majority, with the awareness of gypsies' misery. Meanwhile, active minorities, they appeal to a conflicting socio-political rhetoric, do not follow for such dominant victimizing representation about the gypsies. finish, all in all, it will seem that active minorities should not only continue striving to change the legal power that rules population behavior, but also focus their efforts on the transformation of those stigmata subscribed by the majority that are still guiding private everyday relationships, intimate contact and interaction, and particularly the taboo regarding contact and misgeneration with minority groups members. Thank you and excuse.